Okay, so I'm obviously delighted to be here. It's a great conference, it's a timely conference, and it's always fun to be back here. It's almost like my second home. So let me give you a roadmap of what I want to talk about, and Carlos anticipated some of this. First, I want to review recent trends in the global economy and try to answer the question of whether we might have already entered a phase of deglobalization, like some commentators seem to be implying. And in particular, if we are deglobalizing, might that have to do with a retrenching of global value chains? In the process, I'm going to speculate, and I want to emphasize the word speculate, on the future of globalization and on global value chains. In order to keep this somewhat structured, I have structured the presentation in 10 points. I'm going to go over 10 points in the next 30 minutes. That's a subset of the arguments that I have in this background paper, which was written in October 2020. So as Gianmarco knows, and I look forward to his discussion, my views have changed slightly. You can imagine there's a few things that have happened since October 2020. So I'm perhaps a bit less optimistic than I was back then, but I think I still agree with, I still sort of agree with lots of the things that I was writing back then. Some caveats, I'm speculating on the future of globalization. Some of you that may know my work, that's not very characteristic of me. I'm very conservative in my work. It's much more sort of theoretical, empirical in nature. This is a way more speculative. So I thought I'd put a couple of quotes. The first one is one that all the forecasters here probably love, and I'd like to remind their bosses that their job is difficult. The second one, maybe it's not one that the forecasters will be all that happy with, but I think it's important to understand that there's some limits to what I'm trying to do here. Okay? So let me start with the 10 points, and I'll start with things that I think are facts, that I don't think are particularly controversial. So the first point is that I do not see deglobalization. If it is to happen, I don't think that it has happened yet. So there's obviously various ways I could show you this, but I'm going to start with the most basic measure of globalization that we typically have in mind, which would be the ratio of world trade over world GDP. Now you see this is a ratio that has grown or grew a lot in the last 40 years up to the great financial crisis, particularly in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s was a period of very fast globalization. And it's true that since then it's sort of stabilized or even almost declined. So some folks have drawn a time trend based on the last 7 years and say we're clearly deglobalizing. I think that's a bit cavalier, and I would point out, and that's sort of well established by other people, that this is purely, this small decline in the last few years is purely driven by China. Okay, and it's not because of the trade war or because of decoupling, things that I'm going to talk about later. It's merely coming from the fact that in the 2010s, China moved up the value chain. They started moving from being a pure assembler of goods to a producer of some of the things that went into the final goods, consumer goods, electronics goods they were selling. And that moving up the value chain would naturally reduce the ratio of world trade to world GDP. It's more of a sign of the success of China in growing technologically rather than a hint at deglobalization, although perhaps those two things are ultimately not going to be all that separate from each other. So I typically like this term that the economists came up with a few years ago, which is this notion of slowbalization, a slowdown in the rate of growth of globalization, or even a stagnation in the rate of growth of globalization rather than deglobalizing. The second point I want to make is that this was inevitable. I mean, if you think about what I was plotting here, this is a ratio of world trade to world GDP. It's not exactly a ratio that is bound by one. There's some subtle aspects of the distinction between gross output and GDP. But this is a ratio that we would expect in any well-behaved model to be a stationary variable in a steady state. So in my view, honestly, what is particularly extraordinary is the fact that this is a ratio that over more than 20 years grew at a very, very fast rate. Okay, so what I'm going to argue next is that I think what might be particularly fruitful, if we don't want to do astrology, is to try to understand what happened in the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s, try to see why it might have stalled around the great financial crisis. And perhaps once we understand the facts that were behind that growth, we can try to understand why they cease to operate when they cease to operate, and might they actually start operating in reverse and actually lead to a true process of deglobalization. So what are the key drivers of the hyperglobalization period? So I would highlight 4. I used to highlight only 3, but I added one recently based on some work that I'm doing that led me to kind of rethink about some things, some of my views. But the 4 key drivers I want to emphasize, one is technology, which Carlos anticipated that I was going to talk about. And if you think about this period of the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, this is a period of very fast growth in information and communication technologies. Just place yourselves in 1985, you know. What did we have access to? What didn't we have access to? Computers have become incredibly much more powerful. We are able to transmit information at a much faster speed at long distance than we used to. There's a lot of technological developments that naturally foster globalization because they enhance the ability of economic agents to communicate and coordinate at very long distances. This was coupled by changes in policy and reductions in man-made trade barriers that decrease the cost of the type of intense flow of goods, parts, and components that is underlying the process of globalization, of fragmentation, of growth of global value chains. So obviously the WTO, the GATT, then WTO, did a lot since the late 1940s and the 1950s, but the 80s and 90s see the expansion of the European Union, sees NAFTA, Mercosur, Asian FTA, and in 2001, China's accession to the WTO. These are all developments in policy that are very much pro-liberalization. And then there's pure politics. The fact that at the same time the demand for foreign labor was increasing because of 1 and 2, the supply of foreign labor was increasing in the sense that you've got Eastern Europe or you've got China, countries that are coming out of non-capitalist system and they enter the capitalist system. So you've got labor demand increasing, labor supply increasing. Obviously that's going to increase the amount of fragmentation. The last point that I want to emphasize, that's not in the paper, is also, I think, the cost of capital is actually quite important. This is a period, I'll show you a graph later, where real interest rates decline a lot. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind because we seem to be getting out of that phase. Okay? So that's what I see as the key drivers of deglobalization. What I want to do next is think about technology, policy, politics, cost of capital, and try to understand what is changing and what might be changing. Okay? So let me start with technology, and as Carlos anticipated, I'm actually pretty optimistic. I do believe that technical progress per se will continue to be a driver of globalization. Why do I think that? In part it's because past technical change, not just the ICT, but think about the steamship. There's very few technologies that I can think about in the past that have not actually facilitated the flow of goods across countries. It is true that the ICT revolution per se, or the types of technologies seem to be stalling. Moore's law is still holding, but as Nick Bloom and co-authors have taught us, it's coming at an increasingly high cost. So there's a sense that it's getting harder and harder to improve. But there's lots of other technologies that we're talking about that were not there in the hyper-globalization period. Digital technologies, that's facilitating the matching between buyers and sellers at long distances. Blockchain, not Bitcoin. Blockchain, I believe, is a potentially a truly transformative technology that can actually reduce transaction costs at long distances. And then you've got automation and 3D printing, and I want to flag those because those commentators that are pushing the view that we might be deglobalizing, that's often what they point out, which is if firms in the West went to firms in the East because of low wages to benefit from lower, cheaper labor, well, maybe robots can do that. So there's less need to do that, and we can come back home and produce at home. I would argue, however, that even for automation, industrial robots, it's a little bit unclear that these are deglobalizing forces. And that's based, A, on conceptual aspects, and B, on empirical evidence. So let me zoom in on the case of automation. At first glance, you could say, well, robots are going to basically allow us to not rely on foreign labor. But it's important to understand where we are today and in the foreseeable future in terms of the use of robots. Robots do not produce goods out of thin air, and they're particularly good at assembling goods. I think I had a graph here When I think about robots, I think about these things that are assembling cars. They still need the things to be assembled. They need the doors, they need the tires, and robots are not particularly good at certain types of industrial sectors. So I think for the foreseeable future, we're going to be in a world in which, yes, robots will replace some occupations. There's certainly going to be some assembly workers that are going to be in trouble. But from the point of view of firms, to a large extent, this is going to be an increase. It's going to generate an increase in productivity, an increase in the optimal scale of operation of auto producers, of other types of producers, which I think is going to generate an increase in the demand for parts and components. And to the extent that those parts and components are still coming from abroad, that's actually going to increase world trade. So conceptually, in the paper, I had a simple model to explain this. The effect of automation on trade flows is ambiguous. And in the data, just about every single study I've seen, and the best one is by Michael Webb and Stapleton, is work that has indicated that there is a positive effect of automation on input flows. Okay, and these are studies that are trying to come up with plausibly exogenous variation in automation. Firms that for plausibly exogenous reasons we're automating, we observe that they tend to increase, not decrease, their engagement in world trade. Okay, so it's sort of an infant literature, but I don't see much to be too worried about technology. Let me point out a second aspect of technology, which is it's something to do with how these global value chains were laid out in the world economy, and I think it's important or interesting or fruitful to think about how the characteristics of that expansion might shape how they might be retrenching if they are to be retrenching. So the first point is, even though we often write down models of global value chains, and I've done that, and I'm not Nytia, I've seen some of her work that does the same. We often write down quantitative models of GVCs with constant returns to scale and perfect competition. And there's good reasons why we do that, because otherwise these models get tricky very quickly. In reality, if we think about the industries where global value chains grew, these are typically industries, I talked about the auto industry, for instance, where scale economies are very important. So when setting up these global value chains in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, firms incurred very large fixed costs, which I think, by the way, is important in understanding why, when the pandemic came, many firms were caught in an uncomfortable situation, relying disproportionately on just a handful of suppliers, just because it was very expensive to have a wholly diversified set of suppliers you could rely on for different parts and components. And again, I think interest rates being low at that point probably facilitated actually the formation of those GVCs. There's a significant cost up front, but they were able to pay them. But the point I want to emphasize in particular, and I'm going to come back to this even when I talk about policy and politics, is that this fixed costs very often were sunk in nature. Why? Part of it is, firms are spending a lot of resources trying to understand how countries operate, trying to find the right partners, the right suppliers. These are costs that if you leave the country, they're gone. You're not going to get them back. Even when we're talking about investments in physical capital, structures, equipment, very often those structures would be very specific to firms. That is, maybe you own the land, you can sell the land, but if you want to try to sell a very specialized factory, it's going to be very hard to kind of get back that investment. Okay, so why is that important? Well, we know a lot of work on sunk costs and uncertainty that the sunk nature of fixed costs actually has very important implications. The ex-ante decision to offshore, say in the 1990s, is very different from the ex-post decision to reshore, okay, in the, say, 2020s. Firms might be perceiving that the trade, say, I'll give you an example, we're operating in China, we're suffering the consequences of the US-China trade war, we might be incurring losses at this point in time, but before pulling out of China, we're going to want to know that this shock is a persistent shock. That is, that the geopolitics are going to evolve in a way that we're not going to see in 2 months, Premier Xi and Biden like shaking hands and saying we're friends again. That would be a problem if we've pulled out. Similarly, I'll argue that even though this is a COVID conference, I don't necessarily see big long-run consequences of COVID for globalization, because this was the mother of all shocks, a very large shock. But we're hoping, and we certainly have the feeling now that this is not going to be a persistent shock. Okay, so even if you have large shocks, if they're not perceived to be persistent, we are not likely to see massive amounts of reshoring in the short run. And I'll come back to this. One caveat that makes me a bit more pessimistic is that obviously, even if firms do not pull out, the current environment is one which, because of the trade war, because of uncertainty, because of geopolitics, it's not a time period where firms are going to invest a lot in going abroad. So if there's exit and there's no entry, obviously this will generate some slow, gradual deglobalization. And again, higher interest rates, if they are to stay, this would also make it a bit harder to generate the entry that would replace the natural exit that you might see for a variety of reasons. Okay, so that's my point 5. Let me, before I get into policy, let me make one more point on long-run factors. And here I could spend a lot of time on various aspects. People have talked about, well, aren't we going to see deglobalization because wages in China, wages in a few less developed economies have been growing a lot. It is true they've been growing a lot, but there's a reason why they've been growing a lot. Technology has gotten much better in those countries. And in addition, lots of the fragmentation, a lot of the globalizing we saw was not just with less developed economies, was with economies with very high wages. Comparative advantage operates even when wage levels might actually not be all that different across countries. Folks, maybe Gianmarco will talk about this, and Dick Baldwin's talk a lot about services. And services is really, certainly I think that the growing weight of services in economies is going to play some role in the world economy. I'm just not entirely sure how it's going to play out. Some folks say services are less tradable than manufacturing. So if we spend more and more on services, the ratio of world trade to world GDP is naturally going to fall. Other people say, well, not quite, because services are less tradable than manufacturing, but we're making them more and more tradable. So that may actually be the fuel for further globalization. So I see things going either way, and if I looked at past evidence, and I did that in the background paper, I'm not too clear actually how to think about this and whether that's going to be a boost or a check on globalization. Some folks talk about, there's been economies that have been very open to trade that have grown a lot. China, think about China or other less, smaller open economies that have boomed with GVCs. To the extent that they start growing less, that's also going to reduce the trade to GDP ratio. Again, I've looked at that. I don't think that's going to go very far. I'm a little bit more worried about two factors. The first one is the one on the right panel here, which is if you look at investment rates, they've been steadily going down over time. And the left panel showing you that what I claimed before, that interest rates falling was probably a force towards increased globalization. If I were to kind of project interest rates through the 2020s and 30s, probably they're going to go up and maybe stay up for a while. So that would indicate that that's only going to probably reduce investment rates even further. Why am I worried about investment rates? Capital goods are a big chunk of world trade. Okay, so if we continue to cut investment, that will be a deglobalizing force. And because, as I argued before, laying out global value chains requires high investments. Okay, so to the extent that it becomes more costly, I do think that this is the one aspect that is not politics, that is not geopolitics, that I'm particularly worried about as something to keep an eye on. Okay, so let me turn now to deglobalizing factors related to policy. And that brings me to point number 7, which is where we start seeing some reasons to be concerned. So remember I started with technology, and then there was like multilateral and regional liberalization. If we looked at what's happened in the last few years, there are 3 particularly worrisome developments in terms of trade policy. Obviously, in terms of geopolitics, there's other things, and I'll talk about them later. The first one is the WTO is dead. Okay, so I very much hope that's not going to be the case, and I'm proud to say Ralph Ossa, who's a former student of mine, is now the chief economist of the WTO, so I'm rooting for him that he can do something. But, President Trump and other presidents sort of clearly put out messages saying the WTO is irrelevant. It's proved to be irrelevant. Everything the US and China have done in the last few years is completely against the rules of the WTO, and we have seen that it have very little power to reign in a trade war. So there's a growing sense that the WTO, not just the Doha round is stalled, obviously it's stalled, but it's a deeper problem of credibility of the institution. The second one is at the regional level, we have seen some new agreements signed, but they're sort of marginal. I mean, the big picture is, on the one hand, here in Europe, you've got Brexit, which is a very much a deglobalizing policy development. Lots of talks of some countries, Hungary, that there was a growing sense, or even in Italy, certain segments of politics in Italy calling for, moving a bit away from European integration. So certainly the sentiment is very different than it was in the 1990s. Where I live in the US, we have NAFTA, the new NAFTA, the USMCA, some people call it NAFTA 0.8, because it's sort of a lighter version of NAFTA. If anything, the new provisions are actually slightly less globalizing than they were. So in the regional sense, this idea of maybe we cannot go global, but we're going to go more regional. Yes, but I'm not seeing an awful lot of demand for that at this point in time. And obviously, also the more sort of direct aspect of direct development in the last few years has been the US-China trade war. Okay, so on the policy side, I see definitely much more room for being worried. Now, I think what's particularly fruitful is to think about why is this happening, right? So one view is, this was Trump, right? So point 3 was Trump. Brexit was Gordon Brown. Why did he call a referendum? That was a silly idea.
Cameron.
Was it Cameron? Okay.
No.
All right, so there you go. So you can blame idiosyncratic factors. You can say the Hungary thing is Orban, the thing in Brazil was Bolsonaro. That's tempting, but that's not quite what's happening, right? So lots of economists have looked at this backlash against globalization, looked at different causes, and I think the consensus is that inequality was a big driver of this. The idea that trade, this fragmentation process, generated aggregate gains, it generated steady growth in GDP in many countries, but not everybody gained from this. Okay, there were few folks in these countries that were alienated by the process. Their real income went down. Maybe it went up, but they didn't actually perceive that gain, and they saw very obvious costs of this. So there was a growing sense that the globalization was not a good deal for society. Thank you. So in that sense, I'm worried, right? So once we understand that the reason why we're seeing a backlash is related to the trade-induced inequality, I'm worried about that, because even if I'm optimistic and I think that automation, I think that digital technologies might continue to foster globalization, by their nature, these are going to be forces that are going to generate more inequality. If we start automating things, that's going to kill manual work or sort of relatively low-skilled work. It's not going to kill managerial work, at least for the time being. Maybe robots are going to get better. Digital technologies create superstar effects and things like that are going to tend to increase inequality. So in the same way that the ICT revolution was both generating globalization and was very much skill bias in nature and generated an increase in wage inequality, I do believe that's going to continue to be the case. So the key question here is, and that's, I admit it's particularly relevant for the US more than for Europe, but will the safety net do a better job of cushioning the blow for the losers from globalization? I'm quite pessimistic. Okay, I don't think that even Democrats in the US are particularly committed to raising marginal tax rates or perhaps more fruitfully put in place active labor market policies, which I think would go a long way towards improving or sort of spreading the gains from globalization more widely in society. Okay, so I do believe that point 7 and 8 are basically saying there's growing discontent about globalization, and I honestly don't see that going away anytime soon. Point 9 is on COVID, and again, I apologize if you thought that I was going to give a presentation very much focused on COVID. And when I first wrote about this or started thinking about it, that was much more in my mind, obviously. But I'm much more optimistic now. I'm optimistic, based on facts, which is that the COVID-19 crisis was a very significant trade shock. Economic activity froze, but it even froze disproportionately for world trade. If you look at trade and industrial production, the fall in industrial production was a bit higher than that for world trade, but things recovered very quickly. Now we could go into discussions, and maybe Gianmarco will go into discussions of composition aspects. Part of the fast recovery had to do with the fact that we were all sitting at home with nothing to do other than Amazon and all these things, and we were buying a bunch of goods that were coming from abroad. So that there was a boost generated by not being able to consume services, not going to restaurants and staying at home, and the fact that the fiscal packages that were passed that provided people with money to spend on stuff. So there's part of it, but that may taper off, but services are going to be on the rise. We're traveling again. So I don't believe that COVID per se will be a deglobalizing shock. And in part is related to the sunk nature of sunk costs. And that's something that I comfortably said in the mid-2020 when it was unfolding. We were still not clear how we were going to go back. But we've seen big trade shocks. We've seen the Great Recession generated what we call a trade collapse, which is orders of magnitude more significant than the contraction in GDP around the Great Financial Crisis. We've seen the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. In these shocks, we've seen that trade rebounded very quickly. And it rebounded very quickly because all the adjustment was largely at the intensive margin. Buyers, sellers, they stick together, they reduce volumes, they did not want to separate. Separation rates were low during these episodes. Why? Because they were large shocks, but they were perceived to be temporary. So you don't want to necessarily go through a separation episode. With COVID, we were all worried, and at some point in March 2020, it looked like the world was going to end. But things got better. We got vaccines. So I do believe that because this is a huge but transitory shock, I just don't think that in the long run it's going to impact world trade an awful lot. We could debate about subtle things about international business travel. Is it going to be permanently low? Might that have some effect on trade? But and I've written on that. But I think that's likely to be second order. So in the last 5 minutes, let me get into the last point, which is one where we could expand, and perhaps Gianmarco will expand on that, which is the geopolitical situation. Okay, so again, if we're looking for large and possibly persistent shocks that might lead firms to give up on their investments on their global value chains and rechange and carry out big investments again to go back closer to their home market, I think the geopolitical situation is the leading one. And that's for a variety of reasons. It's not orthogonal to COVID. I think that COVID very much increased diplomatic tensions between the US and China, particularly with the Trump administration. I don't think it was particularly helpful to refer to this as the China virus or the Wuhan virus. That really did not help US-China relationships. In the EU, we've seen increased tensions, partly because of the passing of aid packages and things like that. But there seems to be a sense in which where Europe is not walking out of the pandemic with the same type of harmony that it had before. Inequality, and we'll hear more about this later in this conference, but if I'm worried about inequality triggering populism and anti-globalization forces, COVID is very much an inequality-inducing shock. And not just in the short run, but I'm particularly worried about human capital accumulation, schooling, and things like that. We may walk out with 20 years of increased inequality from a shock that was really not that long, but that had really these persistent effects. So I do believe that if we don't do something about inequality or the perceived inequality-inducing effects of globalization, we are going to continue to see anti-globalizing politicians being elected. Having said this, all this, I'm not saying something new. I think there's lots of people that have been pointing this out, that we seem to be in a situation where a World War III scenario is not a zero probability event. I think I'm a little bit less pessimistic than many people. And that's for at least two reasons. Some folks mentioned Russia, Ukraine. Maybe you'll talk about Russia, Ukraine. There might be questions about it. I am, alarmed with what's going on. I think it's a dramatic shock for Ukraine. I totally condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but in my view, from the point of view of global value chains, of a global economy, this is basically Russia shooting itself in the foot. Okay, and the reason for that is that, yes, they're very important in some goods. I think I have a figure here. They're non-trivial in their involvement in global value chains and sort of primary products, petroleum, gas, and so on. And I'm not going to diminish the short-run implications of that, but if I look at the export structure of Russia, it looks like a gas station, okay? That's basically what they are. So that is going to generate some short-run effects, but global value chains are not going to be severely impacted by this, okay? So I'm not worried about China. What about, I'm not worried about Russia. I'm a bit more worried about China, that the increased tensions between the US and China might lead to a scenario of true decoupling, where China is going to decide to go on their own, try to create a bloc with other Asian countries, perhaps Africa. And that would be very problematic, because as you know, China is very much embedded in global value chains, and from the point of the US and Europe, a China decoupling would be a very, very significant event. I'm a little bit less worried for two reasons. The first one is, I view China as being largely pragmatic, and the messages that have been coming out in the last few years, in the last few months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, indicate a commitment to making things work. They could have aligned much more explicitly with Russia. They chose not to do that, to the point where Putin was really upset about this. They could have taken this as an opportunity to kind of increase, maybe going all the way to invading Taiwan. They have not done that. So I don't see China as, at this point in time, pushing hard for decoupling. It would be very costly for them politically. They're not in a position to do that. I think it would generate economic consequences that would put the Communist Party in danger. And we're seeing in the last few days already that their position is perhaps not as secure as we thought it was with all the protests. So I think first, China is pragmatic, and in part it's pragmatic for my second point, which is not here, but I think it's important, which is technologically, they are still not in a position to go their own way. And that's most clearly illustrated by the semiconductors industry, where it's very important for China, but China still does not have the ability to, to produce certain segments of the industry, design and things like that are key for the industry. So without the U.S., China would be in trouble, and we've seen part of that with the whole Huawei regulations and all this stuff. So again, I guess if I'm just concluding, I don't believe the world is deglobalizing. So any talk about deglobalization it's speculative. It's like, may it happen in the future? It hasn't happened yet. We are clearly globalizing, but that was inevitable. At some point, the ratio of world trade to world GDP was going to have to stabilize. It's hard to conclude, or I cannot conclude myself, that technological developments or COVID-19 per se are going to fuel an era of deglobalization, with a small caveat of the inequality-inducing effects of COVID. The main challenge for the future of globalization, I think, is likely to be institutional and geopolitical in nature. So for the next conference, just end with one word, for the next conference on the future of globalization, I think you guys should really invite a political scientist. I think that you're probably going to get a much tighter prediction for the future of globalization than from an economist. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Paul. Your turn, Gianmarco.
So thank you, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper by Paul. And this is clearly a very difficult paper to discuss, especially if I don't find my slides that are in trabajo. Yes, here we are. Okay, is it here there? I guess.
Control
L. Good. So it is a complex paper because it's not the traditional paper that we discuss with equations and regressions and simulations. So I will be even more speculative than Paul, and I will try to play the political scientist since it was invoked. So it is a I think this is a very rich analysis. It's a paper that has evolved through time, or at least the presentation has evolved through time. It is interesting because it banks some popular, strongly held beliefs, especially in policy circles and in pundits. And I want to highlight two things. So the first is this idea that it is globalization rather than deglobalization, what we are looking into. And then I will highlight this sentence, which is essentially motivating what I'm going to discuss. So as Paul has said, the main challenge for the future of globalization is likely to be institutional and geopolitical in nature. So my view is that what we see in the aggregate in terms of globalization, or for some people deglobalization, is possibly going to obscure, at least to aggregate, things that are quite clearly heterogeneous at a lower level. And so we may see globalization still accelerating, or at least going faster, not regressing too much in selected categories of products and services. Paul has highlighted the fact that it's not obvious that robots are going to substitute imports or trade at all. But also in terms of the partners that are going to be involved in deeper integration. And this would be selected in a sense. So I would like some way to capture this idea with this wording. So we're going to see behind this globalization at the more disaggregated level, what we're going to see is selective reglobalization. So as a compromise between the economic gains that you have of trading with other countries and interacting with other countries and the political vulnerability that we've seen post-COVID and post-war. There are words there that are, in the case of global value chains, are hinting at the same concept, and one is friendshoring by Janet Yellen. And so the idea would be that it's more friendshoring rather than reshoring or shoring and going backwards. What do I mean here is that probably what we can expect is a reconfiguration of the global economy in terms of groups of countries that are like-minded, and some way they compete for some kind of economic, political, and cultural hegemony through these coalitions and alliances. There is a question that has been raised in several parts, and it's part of the debate, and I will try to discuss that now in what comes. And it's this sort of uncomfortable question about globalization for our countries. So is it a good idea? So it is prudent for a democratic society based on market capitalism to maintain economic relations with autocratic societies based on state capitalism, when what we see is that these autocratic societies are becoming more and more aggressive as they get richer, precisely because there is trade. So this is simplistic, and I will show why it is simplistic, but I think it is an important question. So just to summarize, are we looking into something that is a Faustian bargain between our countries and the countries that are not like us? And this has become particularly important because we are seeing in trade, but we're seeing in the economy, in the global economy in general, a rebalancing of forces of countries that are involved. So since I have very few minutes, I want to tell you the history of globalization in 3 slides, and a history of democracy in 1 slide, since the French Revolution. So, of course, this is going to be, borderline ridiculous. But when we think about trade flows, what you have in mind is a network, is a world trade network, which is like everybody is, generally speaking, possibly interacting with all other countries. You can write these flows and look at these flows at different level of the aggregations, but here is very, very aggregated. So these are IMF data. And what is this showing? So how do you summarize what is going on in the trade network? So for those who are into network analysis, there are tons of possible statistics. And one of the statistics, and there's a category of statistics that are centrality indices. This is the simplest one. So you ask a country, which of the other countries is your main trade partner? And then you link the countries to those who are the main trade partners. So this is in the 60s. So let's say it is some way the result of the sort of globalization that has been created after the Second World War, but by the Western countries who won the Second World War. And so it is the multilateral idea that has been developed at that time. So what you see in the 60s, you clearly have already a dominant friend for all the in terms of trade for the other countries, that is the US. And then you have countries that are there possibly and mainly because they still have an importance for their colonies. And then you have a separated group of countries up here that is essentially the Soviet Union and some close friends. Now, it is important to look at this in perspective because this is very different from what we will see nowadays. So there was this Cold War, but we had the Cold War that militarily was balanced in a sense, but economically there was no match. So it was, and there was no interaction either, much of interaction, because the economic systems were very different. So it was separated.
China is not there, right?
So China is somewhere there. If you zoom for after 30 years, so you see China is coming in. The Soviet Union is some way, and the group of countries that the communist countries are gravitating towards Europe. Britain is losing weight, and France and Germany, they create this sort of European center of gravity. And then you have the US and Japan, so this sort of Pacific group of countries that are, and well, an American group of countries that are interacting. Now, you zoom 20, 30 years later, and this is more or less what we have now, and you actually see that things have changed a lot. So there are, I want to highlight, I could spend a day on this, but of course I cannot, but there are some interesting features in this graph. So first of all, you see that there is something that is a European galaxy with Germany at the center and the other countries around. And then there is this group of countries that gravitate around China that has become more important as a first trading partner for a lot of countries, and then the US. But what is, I find, and I always highlight, is that if you ask the US who's the main trade partner, it's going to be China, and if you ask China, that's the US. So this idea of uncoupling that Paul has been highlighting before is not easy, because, and it's possibly it's not going to happen in any sense. An important feature of this picture that clearly is not, maybe is not very visible, is that along the satellite countries, among the satellite countries of China, there are some important emerging economies. And so, yeah, and they're very varied. So you have Australia, which in a sense is a Western democracy. You have Brazil, you have India, you have South Africa, you have Russia. So they're all linked to, more, as a first trading partner, more to China than to the US. So that was the history of globalization. And now in one slide, this is the history of democracy. These are data, you see the sources, they are based in Oxford. And what this is showing is the evolution, I mean, of the share of countries that have different regimes. So closed autocracies, electoral autocracies, electoral democracies, and liberal democracies. So essentially, in our countries, we would be here. Then what is an electoral democracy with respect to a liberal one is that it is a democracy in which you have elections, but some of the basic rights are not guaranteed. So, and then you can move on to all the rest. And what you see is that through time, clearly there's been a contraction of these closed autocracies to the advantage of the rest. So the main features that come out is that when you interpret those shares is that you see that democracy has been advancing since the French Revolution, but it is some way in retreat in recent years. In 2005, 50% of the world population lived in an autocracy, and so it was 50-50 with democracy. Today, 75 live in an autocracy, and the remaining, of course, in democracy. And this thing that I highlighted before in terms of, okay, there may be some military balance with the Soviet Union, but economically there was no match. It's something that now is quite different. We've seen China before, but also when you look at autocracy as a whole, you see that today more than 30% of world output is autocratic, and up from 50% at the end of the 80s. Combined market valuation of listed companies is 30% of the world, up to from 3% over the same period as before. Since the mid-90s, patent applications has increased from 5% to 60%. Of course, we can think about how important are different patterns, but these are big numbers. Yet, the interpretation of this realignment of selective globalization in terms of dictocracy and autocracy is probably simplistic. You can look at different things. Again, for brevity, you can look at votes at the UN General Assembly, and I looked into one in particular, so the vote on suspending Russia for the Human Rights Council after the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, Russia voted against, and also China voted against, and China is the main trade partner of Russia. Other countries were sitting on the fence, so they abstained. Saudi Arabia, Brazil, India, Indonesia, and South Africa. They all have China as the main trading partner, but only one of them is an autocracy. So that's why things are quite simplistic. So to conclude, since the end of the Second World War, what we've seen, again, simplifying a lot, has been a growth in economic integration and a parallel political disintegration. I mean, there are studies on this. There is a paper that was written by Paul's late colleague Alesina on the number of countries that has been growing after the Second World War. Now, this fragmentation, in some way, has made it increasingly attractive to create alliances and to place these countries within economic, political, and military alliances, where the mutual ties you can reliably think that are not going to be used later as tools of coercion. And now if you look at a lot of documents of the US administration, but also the European Union, there is this concept that is floating around, called in different ways. So strategic autonomy, this is the EU terminology, which is open strategic autonomy, for those who want to find what is paradoxical in all that. But I mean, this kind of concept nowadays is really openly in these documents. The problem is that you may think that this sort of selective globalization is a good way to compromise between different aspects, but it is essentially inadequate for some of the most pressing challenges of our time. So here just global warming, poverty, could be inequality, pandemics, wars. I mean, we've seen that coalitions of countries are not very efficient, especially in the case of global warming. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gianmarco. So I think we have a lot of food for thought from Paul's and Gianmarco's presentations, but let's look for more. So the floor is now open for question. Please be brief, because I want to give Paul and Gianmarco the last 5 minutes to react. There is a mic that probably we need to use. Would you press? The next one is Luis, and then Nytia.
Hey, can you hear me? Yes, I wanted to ask and maybe push back on the idea that was advanced that we now know that the political backlash has to do with inequality. And I mean, my feeling is that most of the literature that's dealt with this, at least empirically, looks at changes in the income distribution, but not necessarily as inequality as a state of, there are very unequal countries, and you look at countries that are very unequal and that are stable and that are able to open. And what I think, if you look at the literature on the China shock, which is what they have in mind, what you look is definitely people who become deprived by shocks and that have political attitudes that change over time and thus demand insurance. But these are not necessarily people who are poor. It's more people who are deprived by the effects of shocks or by the unequal sharing of the changes in the income that take place. And so that would be my question. How do you see the link between inequality and trade integration acting, if it's more by changes in the income distribution or by difference in levels?
Yeah, thank you. I like this paper. I've been in the position Gianmarco was in of discussing a previous version of it, and I want to push back on something that's related, which is that the claim or the point that automation necessarily is going to increase inequality. So the examples you gave were of automation substituting for, say, manual routine tasks. But of course, automation could also substitute for what we even think of as cognitive non-routine tasks. So you can think of surgeries as being substituted by automation in the future, right? So that is the effect on inequality depends very much on what types of skills are being substituted for, and it could be that what we currently consider very highly skilled jobs in many situations can be substituted for by automation. So the impact on inequality is unclear.
Anyone else? Rafa.
I would like to ask you about the gains from trade during deglobalization. How the globalization may affect this distribution of gains from trade going forward? I mean, I was tempted to ask about welfare, but that's too complicated. So let's stick to GDP or something like that.
More?
Thank you. Okay. You mentioned that higher interest rates might have an impact on globalization. We in the central bank tend to think it works also the other way. I mean, the globalization that we have seen over the last years is often quoted as the main factor why we've seen such low interest rates as a result of saving lots. So what would be your take if we really see the plateauing of this globalization or even the reverse? What would it mean in terms of what we call natural interest rates? Will we see actually higher interest rates? And what do you think, how important actually is this globalization for the level of interest rates among all other factors? Thank you.
Just a small comment, but it relates to this debate on globalization and inequality. One thing that surprised me is that David Dawn did with colleagues for the Inequality Review and with Penny is that the shocks from China and similar trade shocks, it's not a US dominated thing. And in fact, interestingly, as we're in Spain, the two countries that stand out as having bigger effects, both locally and by product line, are UK and Spain. And it's quite, so in some sense, this kind of point about the localization of trade shocks, both to the kind of types of jobs and localities, which have had a big effect politically, or a huge effect in the UK, of course, seem to be as large over a slightly different time period, but it's a kind of common theme. But there are also economies like Germany that seem to have been much better insured to those. So I think it's not really a US-European contrast, but there are differences here that would be great to understand.
Hi, well, thank you very much for the paper and the great discussion. So after looking at these beautiful maps that Gianmarco was showing, so Paul, you were saying that some part of this globalization is due to different behavior in China, but how much of the previous rise in globalization is due to China, and the fact that China has been, growing a lot? Because I don't know my understanding, but perhaps, I'm just hearing, is that most of the global value chains are mostly, well, that's related to what you were showing in your map, but they're regional, and it's China that actually is making the big, change in the. Right, thanks.
Does this work? Yeah.
You have 7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay. So, first of all, thank you. Thanks for the discussion. I agree that maybe there's no need to bring a political scientist. You could have a very, very compelling discussion. Thank you to Alejandro too for the paper in this. That's a saver. Okay, let me quickly move through the questions. So global warming. Yeah, I mean, I haven't done research on this, so I'm more of a consumer of that literature. It seems clear on a first pass that the rise of global value chains by generating an increase in the extent of shipping involved with the creation of value added has been something that has contributed to global warming, and for the same reason that tighter regulation might actually severely impact those chains. What makes it a little bit less clear is the fact that, and it sort of ties with some answers I'll give, is that the growth of global value chains is basically putting globalization on steroids. So that's going to tend to generate income gains. That's getting a bit to your question, that are disproportionately higher than from more traditional trade. And we know that that clean air is a sort of luxury good, if you will. It's sort of the demand for it grows with income. So I'm not entirely sure where the dust is going to settle. That's a bad metaphor here, but in that I see rising demand for clean air in China and many other developing economies. So economically, it might be somewhat costly, but I don't think that, I do think that we might be moving, that globalization is not going to decrease the pace at which we might move to a cleaner globe. Now, whether that's going to be fast enough to to be able to avoid potentially catastrophic scenarios, that I don't know. Enrique, reconfiguration. Here's where I would sort of invoke the sunk costs. Okay, so I'm a little bit less. I'm a bit more skeptical than the average person about how much reconfiguration that's going to be. First, because diversification sounds like a great thing. And I'm sure that in many boards of major companies, they're talking about this. They're saying, can we find alternative suppliers? Can we move things? And then they send it over and they start crunching numbers. And when they start crunching numbers with higher interest rates and like this big sunk cost, that's where I think lots of firms are going to say, okay, maybe, but let's wait and see how that's going to play out. That's my sense. The link between this and inflation, and I'll come back to interest rates, that's a tough question for me. I think about relative prices. Okay, so I grew up learning that inflation was a monetary thing, and I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, I know that that's probably not right anymore, but I have a hard time thinking about the price level and how it's shaped by globalization, to tell you the truth. Backlash inequality, yes, I'm sorry. I think that was just my, and it comes back to Richard's question too. This is a problem of maybe language. I had in mind the unequal effects of trade on different agents. It's an important point. I mentioned maybe safety net, tax rates. I do believe that it's sort of interesting and puzzling why in the US at least, a period of skill-biased technical change and globalization, which on average they tend to increase inequality, they've been coupled with declines in tax progressivity in that country. That's a bit puzzling to me. In many other countries it's different, I totally get the point. But I would be the first one to say I'm much more pro-active labor market policies that try to kind of zoom in to those that they're impacted by globalization regardless of their income level, than sort of blanket like increases in tax progressivity that might end up not perfectly addressing the issues. So I do think it's important to kind of draw that distinction, and I've done some of that in some of my work. Automation, Nytia. We're not there yet. I mean, yeah, robots have the potential to do lots and lots of things, but I think even astrologists, they don't make forecasts that are over very long periods of time. So I feel like, maybe in 20 years, it's going to be more relevant. Gains from trade, I briefly touched on this. I do think that less developed economies that have embraced globalization and have used it to their advantage have grown much faster, GDP levels, than richer economies. So that's our quantitative models would be consistent with that. It's always hard to tease out exactly what's driving what. I mean, China's open up to trade, but it's gone technologically so much more sophisticated. It's not orthogonal. So how to separate those things is not trivial. We have quantitative models that try to do that, and those would, we talk more about exactly what comes out of those. Interest rates, I'm a trade guy, right? So I'm not good at thinking about price levels. I like trade balance. I know it's not how the world works, but I'm more about integration of goods markets. So the globalization you had in mind is a globalization in capital markets. I think the savings glut, that's sort of one of the many theories for the steady decline in interest rates. I don't think, I've thought a bit about, is it something about the trade side per se, and I'm not entirely sure that the trade side per se, maybe it is that it's been reducing inflation, and that's partly kind of led to lower interest rates by central banks, but I haven't seen a lot of strong evidence for this. And so I've touched upon, yes, I made a statement about U.S. versus Europe, and you're absolutely right that it's much more subtle than that. And yeah, China was, I think, important for that growth. But it's sort of in trade, there's two sides always, right? I mean, China was important for it, but they couldn't have done it alone without all the investment and technology from abroad. So, yeah, I'm not sure what to infer from that, but yeah, I think a counterfactual world without the hundreds of millions of Chinese workers would have been different than the one we have now. I think that I would agree with that.